My name is John.
Alexander.
My name's Chuck.
All right, and we're going to be doing the history of video gaming. Just having a little impromptu discussion.
Abbreviated version.
Yes,
We
abbreviated.
have half an hour.
Yeah. What systems did you guys start playing on?
Oh gosh, the NES, the original one, I saved up for a whole year whenever I was 6 years old, and then my parents contributed a big chunk, of course, and helped me get that. But that was my first real one. We had an old Texas Instruments PC that had the giant cartridges. You plug it in the TV. I played around with that a little bit as well in the beginning, and it's a very underrated system.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Well, I mean, you start off with the Oregon Trail, usually. I mean, that's one of the first things
and
you get
dysentery.
into, and you die of dysentery so many times. But the first home-based system that I'd ever gotten, because that one was, at the school, so that was just a phenomenal adventure. Going in there, learning about math, learning about reading, as well as dying of dysentery. I mean, you cannot get past that as a school-age child. But the first home system I ever got was an Atari 2600. Got it from a yard sale. This thing was beat all to heck, but it was one of the most beloved systems I'd ever had. And then, of course, moving on to the NES, which changed my life forever. And stunted my growth, I believe. But definitely changed my life.
Yeah, that was where I came in, was the original NES. Like, I started to hear other kids at school talk about this thing, and I was like, what's that? And they explained how all this works, and I was like, that sounds pretty cool. So, I probably should have saved up, and instead I just begged my mom to come and have a look at this thing behind this nice glass case.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
especially
it's like, it's only X amount of $100.
Yes.
Or 200, 300, however much it went for. And it's like, finally got it, played it, and well, my mom didn't have to hear me talk about a lot of other, toys that I wanted and everything.
Sure.
So she was like, all right, 3 games. Like, she went all out and got the entire set. It had Mario, Duck Hunt, and World Class Track Meet on it. And the power pad
you had the power pad.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. And so she didn't hear from me for a while.
Yeah, that's why everybody has sore forearms for years.
Yes.
Because you couldn't run on it. You had to beat it. Yeah,
it was like
absolutely.
your hands were more accurate, just patting it. But yeah.
Did you have the gray or the orange zapper?
Oh yeah, the
Orange.
gray. I had the gray.
I had the orange one.
I had the orange one. Yeah.
Yes.
Nice.
I always wondered like what the difference was on them. I was like, orange? Oh well, shoot. And that was at the Dalton.
Yes. Well, I think the audience knows exactly how old we are now, since we all started with the NES.
This is true. Yes.
I'm going fanboy on it here. So.
Yeah, I know.
So, what were your favorite games on there?
Wow, what a great question. There are hundreds of games to choose from. The one that always brought me back to it, it's a little more obscure, the Star Trek 25th Anniversary Edition. I was a huge Star Trek fan growing up, and still am. And the NES edition was different from the one they released on PC, a little bit different story. But it was just so great because I got to fly the Enterprise around. I got to take control of Captain Kirk. Yeah, it had some simple puzzles that were fun to do. It's a very linear game, but at the same time, it was the closest thing I'd ever played to an open world concept.
That's it.
Yes, I could warp to several planets that had absolutely nothing to do except wander around on, but it was an early open world concept. And so I played that game so much, and I actually pulled it out about a year ago and played through. So.
I remember that game, especially whenever you get to the gangster section.
Yes.
And you had to ask Doc to get the keys out of the grate. And that was one of the best things I'd ever seen in my entire life, was that little interaction there. But you're right. I mean, it did change the way that we even looked at the open world games and gave it a huge advantage. So it definitely led the way for a lot of open world games. Very good. Very good choice.
Thank you.
Good choice.
Yeah. For me, the one that would take me back would probably have to be, there's several. Definitely not Top Gun or Transformers. That abomination you introduced me to.
Hey, come on. Some people like robots.
I would probably say Contra or Jackal. Because I like Jackal, the fact that you never got out of the vehicle, and it was just like run and gun, and you could just go over there and blow open a building, and all your guys come running out. And I don't know why, it just always struck me as something fun to play.
Sure.
But I would still go back and play that.
Yeah. So you guys are going to make me say it. You're going to make me say it. The favorite game, because nobody's even touched on it, was the shiny gold cartridge that we all know and love, and that's The Legend of Zelda. And you had to make me say it, all right? Which in reality, you know, Final Fantasy and Zelda, you know, I don't know. They're both kind of up there for me, but I'll have to go with The Legend of Zelda as far as my favorite. But the one that amazed me the most was
The Adventures of Bayou Billy.
I mean, to have a video game speak to me, I've never heard that before in my life. And I'm sitting there looking, I was like, oh. The game was not great, but it spoke to me in such a way that very rarely did I have friends that come in and say The Adventures of Bayou Billy. So I use that as an outlet for me to just sit there. Bayou Billy, how are you feeling today? And it was amazing to me. It was amazing to hear a video game speak to you, especially when dealing with 8-bit.
I was just telling them the same thing the other day. I was like, Bayou, it was awesome.
Oh, it was amazing.
Until you got past the title screen. And
and then it kind of fell apart at that point. But it did speak to you, absolutely. But yeah, I would say Zelda. I mean, of course.
When did Bayou Billy come out? Was that late 80s or was that into the 90s?
I would say mid 80s is what I remember on the copyright screen from my brain image, but that's about it.
I know there were a number of games in the 80s where it had the very digital voice like that. It was big. It was, I guess, 1990 before we had any kind of real, true dialogue in the games and interactive. I'm not sure if it is, but I believe it was King's Quest V was the first one that had the full voice acting. With every character. That was another one of my favorite series growing up was King's Quest. That one was groundbreaking in so many different ways. But yes, you have a little portrait of the character come up, and you've got full dialogue. But it was an actual game instead of just the interactive story, like it was so popular at the time.
Absolutely.
Sega in general, like, you know, the opening screen where it turns white and you have the blue letters and it's like Sega.
Yes.
Or, you know, the little character bits they did where on Jurassic Park, like you see the T-Rex kind of like, you know, looking at you and he goes,
oh yeah.
It was just kind of funny, but that'd be the next time that I remember talking to you, at least before we got into like Sega CD and the discs.
Yeah. So. And that really kind of is a huge improvement upon what was in the past, because you would be, you know, as early as you can remember playing in your pajamas and everything's dark and all of a sudden this huge terrifying noise would happen and, you know, nothing else would happen through the entire thing. So voice acting was a major, huge improvement for video gamers. Except for, I mean, one thing that I like about video games most, and this kind of ties into the history of it as well, as the soundtracks. As a soundtrack, something that you can never put your finger on as far as being what your favorite one could ever be. But just how the genre has grown from the typical tiny 8-bit music to the full orchestras they have out there now. And you know, and we try to go to it every year, is the Legend of Zelda Symphony every single year up at the Skirmerhorn. And
great show.
Oh, absolutely. We've been to it several times. But to just come from that shiny gold cartridge to have an entire orchestra put that on for you, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, MIDI to live orchestras.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. From one guy programming the entire soundtrack on a keyboard in the background to an entire orchestra. I mean, it does definitely speak to how far video gaming has come and how streamlined it is. I mean, nowadays you've got people of all ages, whereas back in the old days, God, that hurts. Every time I say that, something about that hurts me every time I say that. But back in the older days, whenever we would be sitting there in the rooms, and your parents would come out, I was like, "What is that bleepity bloopity?" And then walking on by to where everybody in the world can enjoy the soundtracks, and
it actually is bleepity bloopity. He
That's
is not censoring anything.
No, absolutely, it's bleepity bloopity, and they can make the most intricate detail come alive in those games with those bleeps and bloops.
What was your first response whenever you saw the disc games, the games on CD? Sega Saturn, was it PS1, Sega CD? And
Sega CD. Sega CD was probably one of the most revolutionary moments of my life, just because I had Spider-Man for Sega and Spider-Man for Sega CD. It was a side-by-side comparison to how great video gaming was about to become. Whenever they had the freedom to put that information on a disc instead of a cartridge, That was one of the turning points for me. Just being able to see them side-by-side comparison, especially whenever you had Jurassic Park for Sega and you had Jurassic Park for Sega CD. You know, those two games, very distinguishable to the point where you had the live voice acting instead of just the T-Rex going, Sega. You had Alan Grant as well as the paleontologist that inspired Alan Grant in that game. It was one of the most amazing things in my life, seeing that. So, absolutely.
I think I still have that game at my house where you
should. Everyone should have that game. I've got a couple of copies if you need a couple just to throw around. I've got possibly in my car. But you've got to have at least several copies of that. Wear them around your neck like a chain, because it is amazing. Yeah. So that's my first experience with disc-based, and hadn't turned back since. I love it. Except for Nintendo.
I mentioned King's Quest V already, but I can bring it up again because that was the first commercially successful PC game on a CD-ROM. And it was wonderful because when it came out, you had the option. You can buy a 1 millimeter thick CD, or you can have 15 floppy disks.
Yes.
So, just from a space-saving standpoint, the CD was just so revolutionary because I have space to buy more stuff now.
Absolutely.
Expand my collection even more.
And to go on disc-based, I mean, my father had a single CD player in the home which had one Christmas album on it. That was before the format had even gotten huge. And so to go in and see a computer game, something that I'm interested in, technology, whereas, you go from a Christmas album to one of the most technologically advanced video games, I thought I was in the future. And still do most of the time. But the thing about it is whenever you go from the cartridge base, like you were saying, to just the space-saving disc, it's phenomenal.
Yeah, I would have to say that Night Trap on Sega CD was my first introduction to
Are we really talking Night Trap?
Which could be a whole podcast unto itself. But the first one that really made me get into the system, I would say would probably have to be the Sega Saturn, which was the first CD-based system that I owned. And then I went traded in and got a Sony PlayStation after I saw the one that you had.
Sure.
And I was like, wow, that's awesome. And basically, I love my library of games I had in there, which is one thing that sadly the Sega Saturn lacked. But Pocalypse with Bruce Willis was one of the funnest games. I love that one. But yeah.
But disc-based also give you the ability to, instead of walking through a storyline in about 7 to 8 hours, to literally closing your eyes and wasting 40 to 50 hours in a video game to where the original story had come out. And, and it's still to this day. I mean, there are few games that you can get by with a 9 or 10 hour campaign to where now you're spending 50, 60 hours in these things. And that was one of the first huge leaps for video gaming, was whenever we had went from the 9, 8, 7 hour campaigns of Metal Gear and things of that nature to the 60, 70 movie production hours that you see in these disc-based games.
And that's one thing about it, like you were talking about Final Fantasy VII out there, and like you just sit there and played, and come home and it's like, still here playing? And it's like, yep. And it's like, I remember the first time you bought that game, because I've never been a big RPG person, but the first time that you bought that game and you opened it up and there were, 3 discs in there? Yeah. And it just blew me away. I was like, how big is this game? And then it just went on and on and on, and I was just astounded.
Easily sunk over 300 hours in that game overall. Easily. Now, to defeat the ultimate weapons at the end and things of that nature. I mean, and you had to. And it was one of the things that I attribute to my critical thinking skills of these days is, having to prepare for hours for a battle that you're fixing to go into. It's one of the greatest things about the video game and the history of video games, because I believe it gave a whole group of individuals that ability to critically think. And that's one of the reasons I really love video gaming.
Yeah. Tell you about the disc-based games. Those have evolved so much from the start. When the technology was first there, they had all this space to use on the disc, and it almost seemed like they didn't know what to do with it, because so many of those early games were nothing but essentially interactive movies, to where there's not much of a game to play. What was that? 1991, Sierra Online's The Adventures of Willie Beamish. don't know if you guys are familiar with that or not. There is hardly anything to do except sit there for 3 hours and watch this movie unfold and just, click on your dialogue choices.
Sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
There was one you had, I think it was Wirehead?
Wirehead was one. Grim Fandango was another big one. That was a huge one.
That was huge.
Love that one. And the adventure games like that, that's what they would do. They would use FMVs to fill up that disk space. So absolutely.
And it was like choose your own path.
Oh yeah,
different paths that
you click on a magnifying glass, and it's an hour-long video, and the whole time you're just clapping, like waiting for the next video to occur. Absolutely. So.
Of course, they've kind of brought that back with The Witcher 3.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys have played that one or not. I'm seriously hooked into that game still. And it's just amazing how many cutscenes they have put into that game. Just full video cutscenes, great voice acting.
Absolutely.
It's
and
nice
that's
they finally found the balance, though.
Yes, absolutely. and we're sitting here talking about the history of video, but even in the modern era, look at the history that video games have allowed us to see, like Assassin's Creed. Looking back through that, kind of jumping off on a tangent here, but going back and seeing classic Egypt, for the latest Assassin's Creed. Oh, phenomenal! Going to experience that, as far as even getting into the much more modern era of VR. I think they're having an experiment over there, but having VR to go back and actually touch the scenes in Skyrim to see the castles and the swords and things of that nature. So it's definitely evolved.
What were your thoughts on N64 staying with cartridges after PlayStation 1 had already broken that?
You're in the middle.
I had mixed feelings on that. Number one, I love cartridges simply for the quick load times. I flip the switch, I'm playing. If I put in a CD, I've got 5 to 10 minutes before I get to actually do anything in the game. I thought the 64 was... I'm in a very big minority here. I thought it was a good attempt. I did not like early 3D games. Simply because of the camera angles. They were always twisting so I couldn't see what I wanted to see or do. And so it was very frustrating. At the same time, it was something new and groundbreaking, and I loved it and played hours and hours of it. So, I have no problem with the cartridges. I care more about good game mechanics and an engaging storyline. So, I love the Super Nintendo. Before we start, I was talking about The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. I think that is probably my favorite Zelda game. I love the graphics on it. I could sit down and play those 16-bit graphics now and enjoy it because you can tell the story you need to with them.
Absolutely. That actually does hit back on the cartridge versus disc-based, especially for Nintendo, because Nintendo, they don't need a lot of graphical powerhouse ability. I mean, what they have is these long-running brands such as the Mario, the Zelda, and they can get their stories across without having to have that additional bump in technology. So to go from disc-based on PlayStation to continue with the cartridge-based, I think it was a risky move, but it did pay off in the end because they didn't have to invest all of that money in that graphical powerhouse that the PlayStation had to. So to have it continue on cartridge, I think it was a great move. And like you had said, the 3D games were just a little bit, and I'm going to use the term, I don't know how scientific it is, but a little wonky for me, just because going into it, coming from a 16-bit background and seeing everything in 2D to a 3D, it's much like the VR nowadays. We have a VR system at the house and we can get in on this thing, but you've got 30 minutes until you just feel horrible, with your mind being scrambled and your stomach. And it's so realistic to where I believe that's the leap between 2D and 3D. I played GoldenEye for hours and hours and hours upon end, as well as Mario 64 and everything else in between. But you're right. At the very beginning, it didn't seem right. It felt wrong, a little bit. I was like, wait, what's going on here? To see Mario in 3D, you can't do that. But then you get to Majora's Mask and you get Ocarina of Time, and those completely change your world because, like you said, it's a groundbreaking technology, so you want to invest your time in it. And I believe those games helped the transition along to keep everyone who is used to the 16-bit like we were to get into that new 64-bit era.
See, that just caused me to think about, why I have such, I have strong feelings for 8-bit, but concerning 16-bit, my gap was that I owned the Genesis instead of the SNES. I play the games every once in a while, over at my cousin's house and things like that, and I enjoyed them. but I think that's where my gap in that continuity of story lies. And so whenever N64 came, and you're right, they have the story, and that's what you want to stay with. I went, because they were doing a recapture a generation thing as well. I went with the Sony PlayStation because as I was growing up, like that was, the mature games route, that I wanted, and that's why I went that direction.
Sure.
What my break in that was.
Yeah.
Going into like PS2 and the 128-bit systems. That right there was something different for me because they still had a great library of games. And I remember that I got the PS2 and I brought it over to your place and everything. Then maybe a month or so later, you had the Xbox. And you were, hey, I'm playing this game called Halo.
Oh.
And you handed me this giant controller and I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this?
And then you found out over the next 3 years of your life, you found out what to do with that controller. Absolutely.
It was over. I was just sitting there watching you play and I was like, wow, that looks really good. And you're like, huh? And it's like, yeah, go ahead and hand me one. It was over. I just took my PS to the game store and I was like, hand me an Xbox, give me a copy of Halo, and done.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that game alone just revolutionized. Like I was so excited that you could jump, and not just jump, but jump high in a first-person shooter.
Absolutely.
Like I was blown away. You could jump your body height, and like just the score, the story, the graphics, the everything. I was telling Alexander, like this kid who played Halo 4 in this forum, it was like, why is everybody still excited about Halo 1? Like, what's so great about that? Halo 4 is so much better. And this guy just, puts the kid's nose to the grindstone of, look, this is what you didn't have before this game, and everyone's just, copying it now. But I mean, like, that game just blew me away.
Yeah. You almost jumped in like a sour old man tirade there for a second.
Yeah, I know.
It was just like, this is
what's the best.
Yeah, it's like walking uphill to school both ways, in the snow.
Yes,
that was beautiful.
My VR lawn.
Yes.
That was beautiful. Yeah. But it is true. I mean, whenever we did have that graphical leap, it was phenomenal. I know we're kind of glazing over the PlayStation era, PlayStation 2, but Xbox was truly revolutionary. And I didn't understand why until I had one myself. I had heard all these tales and rumors until I got one myself. But even sidebar games like Pirates of the Caribbean, where you had the massive open world pirate game. And I'm a huge fan of pirates. I'll go ahead and admit it. I love pirates. So to have a game that allowed you to truly experience what that is like, going from open world to open world pirates, even that was enough for me to get me hooked.
So what was your most hated game of all time?
My most hated game of all time, still to this day, has to be, I don't know, I'm kind of going out on a limb here, but The Adventures of Link, Zelda 2. It's painful to admit that. It really is painful to admit that, and I'm kind of in a moment where I'm laying on the psychologist's couch because it did me wrong. The thing about it was I got used to, number one, I got used to the soundtrack. That had changed. You can't change that. That's the most perfect song in the world. Why would you change that? It's like a siren song. Every time you would hear that fire up in the living room, even if it was your brother or your sister or somebody just accidentally hit the power button with their thigh, you heard that come on, and instantly your gamer instincts would light up and you would run to the living room. But the second one was kind of lackluster for me, to be honest with you. Wasn't a huge fan of the side-scrolling section. You couldn't jump, which I guess got rectified in Halo. But the thing about it is it was truly a hard pill to swallow to try. And I see what they did. They tried. They really tried to have an semi-open world RPG with a storyline that you could actually talk to people and things it's a leap to the future, but that game still has to be one of my most hated because of the games that I never liked, I would never play. But that one truly held a crux for me because I loved the first game so much, and I jumped into that. It's painful, but
I think you just hit it right there. If you don't like the game, you're not going to play it. So to really hate a game, it has to be something that I want to play and want to like, but I can't. So I would have to say the Call of Juarez on Xbox. I really wanted to like that game. I liked the concept of it, having two different characters. The voice actor who plays one of them was Gul Dukat in Deep Space Nine, which is It's my favorite show of all time. I wanted to like that game, and half of it was great. When you're playing as the old gunslinger turned preacher turned back to gunslinger, it's your standard generic first-person shooter, and it's fine. It's enjoyable. But the other part of it, when you're playing as Billy, he's a character who is built around stealth, but the game was rushed. There are so many glitches and bugs. It took me 5 years of on and off frustration where I would put it down and not touch it for months to finally finish that game. So it was just so broken. I'm amazed I actually finished it. And it's one of those, I feel more accomplishment after beating that game than most anything else that I've beaten. So yes, I'm glad I finished it, but I hate that game and I don't recommend anyone play it. Watch the YouTube video.
Kudos to you for actually doing it.
Oh.
I also got to slide in something underneath the day and say Mass Effect 3. It's a horrible game. Okay. All right. Go ahead, John.
I would have to say that my most hated game you actually introduced me to, and I had never played it on the original round of the Nintendo, but as an adult, I played the original Transformers.
It's going to hang over my head forever.
And man, like, because I was used to watching Transformers, and Optimus Prime would fight Megatron, or any of the Transformers would fight any of the Autobots would fight any of the Decepticons. They would take shots, they would take abuse, and you know, just you got shot once, your board started over. You got hit by anything once, your board started over, and then you were out of lives, and your game was over.
That's a really bad game.
Yeah, and like I don't know that I ever saw Sean or anybody make it far down the first level without getting shot. And,
no, and you won't.
And you were blown to bits. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, this is the worst game I've ever seen.
Well, you know the history behind that is no one ever thinks that there's a second level. Because you can't get past the first one. So, I mean, they just kind of stopped at the first level and said, hey, we're just going to make it so insanely hard and just save our money for the rest of the game. You know, we'll just go ahead and keep it this long. So, you're absolutely right. But I think the, you know, like we kind of hit on a little bit earlier, it's the ones that are letdowns. You know, the ones that you want to play or your icons that you want to jump into the storyline with. And it's the ones that let you down that really become the most hated games.
Oh, yes. There are plenty of bad games to choose from, but why would we waste our time?
Mm-hmm.
So.
There's one more that I'm going to slide in there, like Mass Effect 3 was Lost Planet. I saw the trailer on TV and I was like, wow, that looks really awesome. I went out and bought it point blank, threw it in, and the controls were one of like some of the worst I had ever experienced, and I just wanted to make sure it wasn't me, so I took it over to some friends' houses and I let them, and they're like, nah, dude, this
it's really bad.
This is awful. Mm-hmm. And I took it straight out after that and sold it.
Yeah.
I was just like, I'm done. Lost Planet was terrible.
Yeah, really bad.
We will stop it there, and I just want to say thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to our guests. And
Oh, nice. Thanks.